Hello, and thanks for joining. I am Nicole Torres, an editor at Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm here with Therese Raphael, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist who's based here in London with me. Hi, Therese.
Hi, Nicole. Nice to be here.
Awesome. Happy Friday. So lately, we've been talking a lot about the UN climate change conference that the UK is hosting in Scotland in about a week. And so we're here to explain what this is, why it's a big deal, and what to look out for. So Therese, maybe to start, can you just explain what is COP26 and why does it matter?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, COP stands for Conferences of the Parties. The conference taking place in Glasgow, Scotland from October 31st for 2 weeks. It's actually the 26th time countries have gathered under this UN Convention on Climate Change that dates back to 1992. That's why we call it COP26. The goal here is very simple. It's to keep hope alive, as the United Nations and Britain, which is hosting the conference, puts it. And that's hope of containing the rise in global temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that means cutting carbon emissions much faster than countries are already doing it. Then the danger of missing the target is more very extreme weather events, from heat waves to droughts to floods and wildfires. So the stakes here really couldn't be higher. And the purpose of the summit is really to get concrete commitments for action. But of course, those are costly, and the United Nations wants nations to divide the financing between adaptation measures, which help countries adapt to climate changes, say with coastal defense systems, and mitigation, the decarbonization measures that we've been hearing about so much.
So who is going to be at this conference?
I couldn't tell you all 25,000 people. It's a very, very big convention. It starts with around 100 heads of state. That includes, obviously, the host, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Queen Elizabeth. But there'll also be thousands of diplomats who will be in negotiating rooms over the course of those 2 weeks. In addition, there will be business leaders, activists like Greta Thunberg, academic experts. All of them will be there keeping tabs on the proceedings. Another prominent voice, Pope Francis, will not be in Glasgow, but I think the Vatican's presence will be felt there. He may address the gathering remotely. The Pope, as you may know, issued an encyclical in 2015 called Laudato Si that was a very eloquent argument for action on climate change. So, that's another prominent voice with lots of followers that we can expect to hear from there.
So speaking of who won't be there, are there other absences that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so Russia's Vladimir Putin is not going. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is not going. And China's Xi Jinping, at least I think as of this recording, still hasn't RSVP'd to his invite, so his intentions are unclear. And China's participation is really crucial here. It's the world's biggest polluter with 27% of global greenhouse emissions. Xi, at the Leaders Summit in April, committed to controlling coal generation to 2025 and then phasing it out. But the problem is China's current targets are not sufficient to meet those the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They're more consistent with warming of about 3 degrees Celsius. So, there's a huge question mark over what China is prepared to do here.
So this is the 26th COP. What have past meetings achieved?
So the first COP, and I'm not going to go through all 25 of them to our viewers' great relief. The first COP was held in Berlin in 95, and that laid the groundwork for the 97 Kyoto Protocol, which was quite a big deal because it was the first real attempt to restrict carbon. But it largely failed because there was not enough engagement of the developing world. There was no real agreement on burden sharing. US President at the time, George W. Bush, rejected it because he said China, India, and other major emerging greenhouse emitters weren't doing enough. And so that sort of floundered. Those disputes continued. And then in Paris in 2015, COP21 was really the breakthrough summit. That saw nearly 200 countries, rich countries, poor countries, agree to limit temperatures to 1.5 to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's what became known as the Paris Agreement. The EU and the US were really instrumental in that, but so were a lot of poorer, more vulnerable countries who really came on board there. So it was the first time we saw a real joined up effort on climate change. Donald Trump pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, but then Americans pulled Donald Trump out of office. President Biden was elected, and he signed the U.S. right back up.
So what has there been anything significant that's changed since that key Paris COP that might affect what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, I think the Paris conference sort of set the big goal. It set the bar for combating climate change. But the hope in Glasgow is that there will be much more specific pledges to cut emissions, to manage countries' exposure to climate change. So, this is really where the commitments get concrete. But I think the big thing that has changed, at least to my mind, since Paris and in recent years, is public perception and the pressure on politicians to respond to climate change. I think it's no longer a fringe issue in any way. It's central to many mainstream political parties. I'd say most mainstream political parties. It's something that most publics, at least in Western democracies, are acutely aware of. And activists like Greta Thunberg have done so much to raise awareness of the issue. So I think in terms of the visibility on the global stage of this conference, it's in another league with the previous 25 COPs.
And shifting to the UK, so the UK is hosting COP26. Shifting to the UK for a bit, and I think we have some fun graphics that we can flash up on screen. Hosting this conference must be a pretty big deal for UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Can you tell us a bit about what his priorities for this are?
Yeah, sure. No, it's undoubtedly his biggest moment, I think, on the global stage. He did give a speech to the United Nations recently, but he is the host. The UK was the first country to commit in law to reaching net zero by 2050. So the host credibility is on the line here. Now, Johnson characterizes his priorities as coal, cars, cash, and I always forget the fourth, it's trees. It doesn't begin with a C. He wants, obviously, an end to coal use. He wants us to use electric vehicles, more financial support for the transition, more forestation. But the big goal, I think, is going to be to get the developing world to contribute to cutting emissions in exchange for rich countries helping to finance it. So they're trying to get to at least $100 billion of financing for green, clean technologies each year till 2025, and that's quite an ambitious target.
And maybe we can talk about how the UK is doing. So the UK was the first country, I believe, to set a goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. How close are they to reaching that goal?
Right. So I'd say on the positive side, the UK has been pretty successful in cutting emissions. It fell by 40% between 1990 and 2019. Britain is now a world leader in offshore wind power. But a lot of what's been accomplished up to now was sort of low-hanging fruit, shutting down coal-fired power stations, building up renewable energy supplies. A lot of consumer devices that people have been purchasing since then are just much more energy efficient. So all of that helped with reducing Britain's carbon footprint. But the hard work really starts now, because if they're going to cut emissions by 78% by 2035, there's just a massive gap to close. I think housing accounts for about 14% of the UK's greenhouse emissions because there's so many gas boilers in the country. Insulation is poor in a lot of the old housing stock. So these are very difficult things to change. And the government is now issuing a lot of new policies. There was a recent one this week on helping people switch out their gas boilers and use heat pumps, but getting people to move from, gas boilers to heat pumps, from diesel and petrol cars to electric cars, those are big shifts, and they're going to be costly. And so that's created a lot of debate.
Do you know how costly they will be?
I knew you were going to ask that. So it's really hard to estimate the costs of getting to net zero. Some time ago, the Climate Change Commission, which is an independent body, put the cost at, I think it was about $70 billion a year for the next 3 decades. So pretty enormous. Boris Johnson himself tends to deflect questions about cost. Even the Treasury doesn't want to get too specific. He recently met a group of high-powered investors in London, and he said, look, green is good. And his pitch is that there's a lot of money to be made in new green technologies and financings, which is undoubtedly true. Problem for him is the politics isn't very straightforward. So within his own party, there are conservative lawmakers who worry that pushing too hard, too fast is going to sacrifice economic growth, balloon the budget deficit, and damage the party's reputation for fiscal responsibility. And then there are also voters in the north of the country who Johnson relies on to keep his majority, who are suspicious that some of these measures are going to fall most heavily on poor and more deprived areas. So they're more skeptical of the plan. He's very conscious of that. He wrote an op-ed in The Sun, a right-wing tabloid recently, and it was really directed at those voters. And he said, the green shirts of the boiler police are not going to kick down your door with sandal-clad feet and seize at carrot point your trusty old combi boilers. He's really trying to reassure them, trying to reassure his party, and yet still promising to meet these very, very ambitious commitments. And so all of that is it's going to be costly. It's not clear yet how costly or how those costs break down.
I guess one way of thinking about, or starting to think about how people might respond is how do UK consumers in general compare to those in other countries when it comes to environmental and green initiatives?
So, yeah, in overall terms of controlling greenhouse gas emissions, the UK ranks pretty well. I think by one measure, it's 7th among countries overall, but there's a long way to go. So in 2020, just over 10% of new vehicle purchases were electric. And it's a big jump from 2.8% in 2018, but it still leaves a lot of cars running on gas and diesel, and it suggests that consumers have still not really made that leap. In terms of meat consumption, Britain ranks among the world's top carnivores. So, that's a big area where improvement is needed, as well, as land use. And it's not clear how quickly those sorts of habits can be changed. It's going to take a lot more awareness and a lot more, I think, better government messaging and some nudging probably in terms of taxes and regulations and other incentives.
And I think something else that's weighing on people's minds, consumers, is the current energy crisis. So is that how's that going to affect the world's climate goals, and especially, COP26?
Yeah, well, we've seen the most extraordinary rise in wholesale energy prices, haven't we? It does make the case for moving to renewables in the strongest terms, but the problem is renewables aren't yet entirely reliable. A lot of these technologies are still rapidly developing. What happens when the wind doesn't blow in Britain, as we saw happen recently, and that contributed also to the increase in prices. I guess the other way it plays in is that the government ends up absorbing some of the cost to consumers of this rise in wholesale prices. So it's going, and that will also affect government budgets, and to the extent that the budgets are limited, I think that will leave maybe less capacity to address some of the transition costs. So I think we'll have to see how long the energy crunch that we're facing lasts. But the big question is really China, because China has signaled that there's pressure to ramp up coal production, coal imports. If China backslides on its already insufficient commitments, I think we will see a very tangible impact on fighting climate change from this period.
So COP26 is going to be on our radar for the next couple of weeks. Are you optimistic about this meeting? Can you tell us what success would look like and what we should be watching out for?
Well, in his interview with Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite, Boris Johnson was really trying to play down expectations. He said these talks are going to be extremely tough. So, this is a prime minister who's not sure really what he's going to get out of this in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks from October 31st. We will get some kind of declaration at the end. We should see more countries announcing they're going to ditch coal and reduce emissions of methane. So I think we could, safely tick that box. We will hopefully get some concrete commitments on halting deforestation, phasing out the internal combustion engine, moving us all toward electric vehicles and that sort of thing. But there are a lot of details to be worked out. So, for example, mechanisms for purchasing carbon credits or indemnifying poorer countries to help them meet their climate commitments. All of that is going to be subject to negotiation. And most of these big changes are going to be costly. So I would say, we shouldn't expect immediate effects right after COP26. Some of these are going to have very long phase-in times. Why I'm optimistic? I'm optimistic because there are very positive signs that countries are taking climate change more seriously than they ever have before. I'm optimistic because investment in green tech, innovation is proceeding at a really encouraging pace. I'm less optimistic that what happens at COP26 is going to meet that bar that was set in Paris of getting global warming down below 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think that even after COP26, there's still going to be a pretty wide gap to be addressed and lots of work still to be done.
We will be watching to see what happens. Thank you so much, Therese, and thanks everyone for watching. You can follow Therese on Twitter at ThereseRaphael1 and read all of our COP26 and climate change coverage on Bloomberg.com and